Since I started working security at the bank, I always figured that the worst case scenario for me would be a heist gone wrong, turning into a hostage situation. I never expected that the craziest event of my career would happen while I was on my lunch break getting a burger at McDonald's. I'd swing by Mickey D's 2 or 3 times a week since it was right next to the bank, tucked in between a sporting goods store and a Hobby Lobby. That certainly contributed to my weight gain over the last year. The food was all right for the price, and it was a good place to people watch as they milled about the street. I was waiting in line trying to decide between a Big Mac and a spicy chicken sandwich when I heard the argument start. 2 men were walking in the door, one after the other, already yelling at each other. The first one, an average-sized guy in a construction worker's vest and jeans, seemed to be trying to walk away from the man that was following him. The second guy made my skin crawl. The dude coming in behind the construction worker was a massive, easy 6'5" and swollen with muscles. He was wearing a tank top and shorts. You could see the veins popping over his arms and calves as he stormed in, face red and teeth clenched. Whatever the construction guy did to tick off this bodybuilder, it was clear the big guy wasn't gonna let it go. The smaller man was surprisingly chill, given that the ogre was barking at him. It was something about a parking space. Everyone in the McDonald's was looking at the pair. Yellow vest dude calmly got in line behind me, crossed his arms, and refused to acknowledge the other man. This only served to further enrage the bodybuilder. I looked over the giant in the corner of my eye. When he walked in, I figured he was probably in his mid-20s. Up close, however, I could see he was much older. His skin was leathery and dry, so dry in fact that I could see the individual lines and valleys of his bloated muscles in his neck. I'm hardly an expert, but I was certain that the man must have been practically swimming in steroids. His shoulders looked like a pair of cannonballs stuffed into pantyhose. The man's chest was as wide as a big screen TV, and his bald head reflected the heart fluorescent lighting of the McDonald's. The bodybuilder's mass made his outfit all the more ridiculous. His tank top was barely a stringer and 2 sizes too small. The straps were pushed to their limit by his lumpy pectorals. His shorts ended a good 6 inches above his knee, revealing an artificially tanned slab of quadriceps. A faded green fanny pack hung from his waist. The overall effect was simultaneously absurd and terrifying. I wasn't sure how the construction worker could remain so relaxed with that monster shouting at him. After nearly a minute of being ignored, the bodybuilder growled and put a meaty hand on the other man's shoulder. I saw the construction worker's face finally show signs of anger. Before he could turn, the giant yanked him back, causing him to spin and nearly fall. One bulbous finger appeared under the smaller man's nose. The bodybuilder was snarling in his face. I considered stepping in, but I didn't have any authority outside of the bank. I wasn't security at McDonald's. I was just another customer. I never got a chance to decide to act or hang back. The bodybuilder shoved the other man hard, then stepped forward in the same motion, arm cocking back for a punch, but the construction guy was tougher than he looked. The shove made him stumble, but he caught his balance and saw the punch coming. He swung first and faster, catching the giant right on his jaw. The big man's head rolled back and he fell hard, crashing into the tiled floor, tailbone first. He was only dazed for a moment, but when he got back up, all he did was scowl and walk out of the McDonald's. The restaurant was silent for a moment. Then someone clapped. I heard another person mutter, "Good riddance." I gave the construction worker a nod and he nodded back. Just like that, the situation was diffused. A few minutes later, I placed my order and sat down at one of the smaller tables to wait for my food. I didn't bother to look at the door when I heard the little bell announcing as a new customer rang. It wasn't until I heard a gasp that I swiveled my chair. The bodybuilder was back. He had a fresh-looking wooden baseball bat in both hands. Time stood still. The construction worker was in front of the counter, placing his order. There was a scream. He started to turn, but the bodybuilder was already behind him. The giant closed the distance between the door and the counter in 3 huge steps, swinging the bat high on the last. It was a shame that the construction guy wasn't wearing his hard hat. The baseball bat made direct contact with the back of his head, just above the end of his spine. I wished I was further back and I didn't have such a clear view. The man's skull fractured with the first blow. I heard a distant crack that echoed across the McDonald's. He dropped, either dead or knocked out, before he even knew what hit him. But the bodybuilder didn't stop. The big man kept swinging, even after the victim was down, raining blows on an unmoving body. Bones were breaking, limbs distorting, and a spray of blood dripped down from below the counter onto the floor. Other than a few screams at the start, the restaurant was eerily quiet. You could hear the thump, thump, thump of the bat impacting the meat that used to be a living, breathing person. Finally, after nearly a minute of swinging, the bodybuilder stopped and stood up, panting. He took a step towards the door. There was blood splattered all over his tank top, too. A dozen witnesses had just seen him commit murder. There was no chance for him to get away, but I still felt a compulsion to stop him from leaving. What he'd just done was barbaric. I couldn't give him an opportunity to avoid justice, no matter how small. "Stop!" I commanded, rising from my seat and trying to use my best security guard tone. But I heard my voice break at the end and realized that my hands were shaking. The bodybuilder turned towards me, still breathing heavily, twisting his grip back and forth on the baseball bat. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. The bank I worked at was small time, privately owned and hardly worth robbing. They didn't want armed security in the lobby scaring customers, so all I had on me was a radio and pepper spray. Would pepper spray stop this troll of a man? "Stop! Hands where I can see them," I said. "Drop the bat!" The bodybuilder charged. I only just then did I get my pepper spray from its holster and fired off a burst before the man was on me. It was more luck than skill that the stream caught him square in the eyes. Even in his berserker state, the pain must have been vicious. He screamed and swung the bat blind, missing me completely. I slipped past him and got him in the face again with the mace when he turned towards me. I held down the stopper until the canister was empty and the bodybuilder was curled on the ground, wiping at his face. I almost collapsed from the adrenaline dump. The police showed up minutes later. Someone had called them as soon as the giant came back with the bat. He must have bought it right before the attack at a sporting goods store right next to McDonald's. The club still had a big sale sticker on it. Unfortunately, I ended up hitting a few people with the crossfire when I used my pepper spray. Given the situation, nobody pressed charges, but I still felt terrible and ended up quitting my job as a security officer a few weeks later. Once you see chunks of brain on a baseball bat, it's a great motivator to go back to school so you can end up with a cushy office job. Street preachers are always talking about the end of the world. They're all fire this and flood that, and locusts should be on by Tuesday. It's easy to tune them out, especially since most of them look like wild-eyed mountain men. But Joel was different. I saw him every day that I went to the McDonald's on the corner. He would be out front, rain or shine, strumming his guitar and promising us that the end was nigh. Joel didn't look like a typical street preacher either. He was straight-laced, clean-shaven, and always dressed in pressed khakis and a blue button-down. There was no tip jar in front of Joel, no pamphlets or products, or cardboard signs. He was joined by a pretty blonde some days who sang along with him and occasionally carried a tambourine. She liked to wear white dresses and denim jackets, I found out through the grapevine that they were married, though they looked similar enough they could be related. Joel and Mrs. whatever their last name was seemed harmless enough, but their songs were occasionally disturbing. Most customers avoided the corner booth in the McDonald's closet to the pair. You could hear muffled voices of their music seeping through the glass if you listened carefully. I sat in the booth one rainy morning to eat my breakfast. I was curious about Joel and wanted to hear a few songs from the comfort of the warm, dry restaurant. For the most part, his songs were saccharine but toothless. He cheerfully sang about sinners finding one hell of a surprise when they die, or how Jesus loves some of us but not all of us, and only the chosen know the list. That kind of crap. A few of the tunes, though, were genuinely unnerving. I couldn't catch all the lyrics through the rain-slick glass, but I remember a few in particular making me squirm. The sun will crash to swallow us all. Oh, fire, burn us clean. Joel sang gleefully. Our ears will burst like bags of blood when the angels begin to sing. The street preacher turned and looked inside the McDonald's, making direct eye contact with me. He smiled, showing white, square teeth, just a little too big for his mouth. I slid out of the booth, picked up my breakfast, and went to look for another table. A few of my friends worked at McDonald's, and I heard through them that the manager kept trying to get the cops to chase Joel off. But there wasn't much that they could do as long as he stayed outside. It was a public street, and Joel even had a busker's license, apparently. So he became a fixture in front of the building, strumming his guitar and singing his happy songs about Judgment Day. I frequented the McDonald's often in the spring before Joel snapped. He was outside every single day, but I noticed that his wife joined him less and less. His songs became a little more manic, his smile more forced. I remember passing him one day when he was clenching his teeth so hard that I thought his grin might shatter like a dropped dinner plate. A week went by with no sign of Mrs. Street Preacher, and I started to notice that Joel wasn't looking as put together as usual. He actually came into the McDonald's for the first time that I ever saw. Joel ordered a Big Mac combo and ate alone with his guitar propped up across from him in the booth. Joel's eyes were red and puffy, like he'd been crying, but that same big smile was frozen on his face. The effect was unnerving, and for a moment, I considered asking him if he was okay. Then he began humming to himself, and I decided to leave it alone. That was the day before the incident, and I still regret not approaching him. I doubt I could have helped, but you never know. It was rare for me to visit McDonald's on back-to-back days, but that next morning, I was craving a bacon, egg, and cheese bagel. I got to the place early, just as the sun was slipping up over the horizon. Joel was already at his station, but he was looking kind of rough. His shirt was half tucked into scuffed pants that had a rip at the knee. Joel's hair, usually combed and gelled, was a tangled mess, and there was a scrape on his cheek. It looked like he'd spent the night sleeping outside on the street. His eyes were the worst part, wide and blue and unhinged. They darted here and there, then went blank for long moments in a 1,000-yard stare. I hurried past the preacher into the McDonald's. Just as I was about to order, I heard the bell chime from the door, followed by the sounds of a guitar. Joel was playing his instrument inside the building. Even though it was early, the McDonald's was full with the breakfast crowd. I saw folks wincing as Joel began to belt out his favorite song. The sun will crash to swallow us all. Oh, fire, burn us clean. Our ears will burst like bags of blood when the angels begin to sing. Several tables got up and walked out. The street preacher was smiling so wide, I half expected his jaw to break. He walked between booths, strumming his guitar and trying to encourage guests to sing along with him. A short, pudgy manager came shuffling out of the back office and made a beeline for Joel. The manager was whispering but clearly furious. Joel didn't even acknowledge him, other than to play louder and more off-key. His worship songs were quickly becoming a discordant noise. I saw the trouble coming in before I started. There was a family of 4 eating breakfast in the corner booth. The kids were squealing along with the music, clapping small hands and knocking their food all over the table. Their mother had her hands at her temples, probably dealing with a headache from all the racket. But the dad was clearly growing more enraged by the moment. A thick, purple vein was beginning to bulge on his forehead. I heard his knuckles crack as he clenched both his fists. Joel was moving closer to the family, the manager trailing on his heels. He wasn't properly singing anymore, just humming along as random notes came spilling from his guitar. The man at the table stood up as Joel approached, and I winced, waiting for his fists to start flying. But there was no fight. Instead, the raging dad simply ripped the guitar from Joel's hands, lifted it high over his head, and smashed it on the ground. The entire McDonald's was silent. Joel's guitar was reduced to a pile of wood and wire. The dad dropped it and sat back down. Joel's scream ripped through the restaurant. It was a cry of anger or sadness or anything I could recognize. Madness, maybe. The guttural sound of a man pushed too far. "Why did you make me leave her?" he shouted at the ceiling. "I served you all my life. You left me nothing." I'm not sure if Joel expected God to answer, but either way, he didn't wait for a response. Joel took off towards the counter at a sprint, leaping over the barrier, causing the cashiers to scatter. He looked around the back of the restaurant, took 2 steps into the kitchen, and stopped in front of the French fry station. Before anyone could react, Joel plunged his hands into the deep fryer, which was still filled with boiling vegetable oil. After several seconds, Joel pulled his hands out and held them up. He never screamed, only kept smiling. At least one cashier fainted, and several customers screamed. The oil had left his hands covered in searing 3rd-degree burns. The skin was red and wet, swollen to the point where it looked like it was about to drip off. "The sun will crash to swallow us all," Joel whispered. "Oh, fire, burn us clean."